Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I start by congratulating the honourable member for Stalybridge and Hyde for securing this debate, and also add my thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for allowing the time for this very important issue of aerotoxic cabin air to be properly discussed today. And I would like to start by associating myself with all of the words from the honourable gentleman for Stalybridge and Hyde, and as I say, agree with what he was saying. Matt Bass was my former constituent, and therefore I would like to dedicate in tribute to him my remarks today, and all of the other individuals who have been affected by possible aerotoxic syndrome. I first became aware of this issue only about a year ago. As honourable and right honourable members across the chamber will know, we were busy engaging with our local communities. And whether I met with constituents in Ifield Ward or at the other side of my constituency in Maidenbower Ward, this was a matter that people were raising with me. Perhaps not so surprising, Gatwick Airport is within my constituency, and I'm very fortunate that my constituency contains the headquarters of Virgin Atlantic Airlines, many charter companies like TUI Travel. Also, it is the airport of the largest operations anywhere of EasyJet, and of course British Airways fly from the airport, as well as many other airlines as well. Therefore, unsurprisingly, Mrs Gillen, many people in my constituency work in the aviation industry, and clearly what struck me was this was a huge concern to them. Fortunately being returned to this place at the last general election, one of the first things that I sought to do was raise the issue of toxicity in cabin air, and I was pleased to call for a debate on the floor of the House in July last year, and followed that up with a letter to the Secretary of State for Transport, and indeed raised the issue with my honourable friend, the Aviation Minister, and I've been grateful for the replies that I have received. As the honourable gentleman, the member for Stalybridge and Hyde, has clearly outlined, the vast majority of aircraft, because obviously they're flying at a very high altitude and have to force the intake of air for passengers and crew to breathe. That usually takes place through the engines, right next to where lubricants are often used for the operation of those engines, and on all too many incidents that have been reported to me, that can cause, I believe, contamination of that cabin air, and I think it is highly suspect that that contamination has been the cause of some of the awful illnesses that a number of aviation crew have experienced. Of course, I'd be delighted to.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does the honourable member agree with me that some of the symptoms could be confused with other illnesses, and therefore a misdiagnosis could occur? Worryingly, for short exposures, effects are usually reversible, but for cabin crew who may be exposed on a more regular basis, permanent neurological damage could occur, and as we've heard, could be fatal.
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, Mrs Gillen. Yes, I think that is indeed a distinct possibility. As the honourable gentleman, the member for Stalybridge and Hyde, said, many of us, members of Parliament, are not doctors. We're not necessarily medically trained, although there are some notable exceptions to that. So I don't think it is for us to seek to diagnose. But what I was hinting at in the strongest possible terms is that it seems to me that the symptoms that many cabin crew have been subject to. First of all, yes, can be confused with other conditions such as Crohn's disease, which I think was mentioned earlier on. But also, it seems to me, in the research that I have done on this issue, that it is highly likely that aerotoxic syndrome is a real result, a health outcome of prolonged exposure to toxic air, and therefore this issue deserves the attention of Parliament and deserves the attention of the Department for Transport. As was mentioned earlier on, yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. This was brought to my attention by two of my constituents, Jackie Purdon and Lyndon Perkins, are both cabin crew on long-haul flights. To the best of my knowledge, the term aerotoxic syndrome was first suggested in medical terms in 1999. Would the honourable member agree that, given the passage of time, it would be a travesty if an investigation was not convened at the earliest possible opportunity?
Well, yes, and the evidence that I have found is that, indeed, slightly before 1999, this issue was started to be spoken about in the mid-1990s, so it is now around 20 years since this issue was first starting to be identified, and I think means that we shouldn't be losing any more time in having a proper investigation into this issue. As the Honourable Gentleman for Stalybridge and Hyde said earlier on, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner is actually the latest type of aircraft not to have cabin air come in through the engines, and that is welcome, and I'm very pleased that airlines that operate from Gatwick Airport, such as Thomson and also Virgin Atlantic, they've ordered 21 Boeing 787 Dreamliners. That is positive, I think, in terms of the working environment of those cabin crew and indeed those pilots on the flight deck as well, not to mention our passengers. But of course the vast majority of aircraft still are, whether long or short haul flights, are still ones that do have the air coming in through the engine intake, and therefore this is an issue that I think will be not only has been very growingly sort of current over the last 2 decades, but will be around for a long time to come unless it is properly addressed. I've been very grateful, as I said earlier on, Mrs. Gillan, for the responses that I've received from the Aviation Minister. And I'm encouraged that the European Agency, the European Aviation Standards Agency, and also the Civil Aviation Authority are looking into the issue, and I understand that they have said that they are aiming to report on their findings later on this year. And what I would encourage the Department for Transport to do is to ensure that both of those agencies, both ESA and the CAA, do indeed follow through on the research that they are carrying out into this, that we maintain the pressure on the industry to take this matter very seriously. As was said earlier on as well, the British Aviation... I will be delighted to.
Thank you. On precisely the issue of the Civil Aviation Authority, this matter briefly was brought to my attention by one of my constituents, Mr. Dominic Monaghan, whose nephew, Matthew Bass, long-standing cabin crew with EasyJet, died in circumstances in 2014, which seemed to be have implications for aerotoxic syndrome. Would the member agree with me that, in fact, the Civil Aviation Authority has been rather dilatory in researching and approaching and regulating this matter, and that I agree with him that they must report back to the public and to Parliament as quickly as possible so that we can move forward and actually clear up this whole issue?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, and yes, I agree. I think it is very important now that given the number of suspected incidents that have been reported, which, as I say, even though I'm not medically trained, I'm increasingly convinced by, and given the time that this issue has been known about, I don't think we can lose any more time in terms of properly investigating this matter, and therefore